I will come in to him and will sup with him and he with me. The Armenians will take this verse and try to use it to preach the gospel. That's not what this is about. This is a letter that Christ told John to write to a specific church. Yes, it is for us to learn from, but as descendants of these early churches, but this is not speaking of salvation. This is speaking of those who have strayed from the Lord. Notice he says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." In other words, he's not even in the building with them. This is speaking of the Lord. They're having church service and he's not even in there with them. Now, how you get the salvation or the plan of salvation out of that, I don't know. It's clear if you read this in its context. But how sad a thought is that they're having a worship service and the one they're supposed to be worshiping is not even there, not even in the room with them. He says, "I will come in to him and will sup." Or he says, "If any man hear my voice and open the door." They don't even hear his voice. But if they will hear his voice, he'll come in with them. And he doesn't say all of them. He says, if any man will hear my voice. That's a sad witness for one of the Lord's churches when he's not even there with them in their worship service. That's how bad they had gone off and how bad they had fallen. So, back in Colossians, the city of Colossians, a little bit of history of the city itself, had been very prosperous at one time, a very prosperous trade city. It was the trade routes ran all through that part of the world, from Asia and going towards Europe and to Africa and all those places and Arabia. They were, if you look at a map and see the nation of Turkey, which is where they would be today, it was the crossroads of the world at that time. That's where a lot of these cities that these churches were in, though they were steeped in paganism and had been under pagan rule for many generations. We can look back through the Old Testament, and you can see how the Assyrians and the Babylonians and different ones that over the ages had controlled those places, and then later the Greeks and the Romans. All these nations that had controlled these places had been full of false gods, worship of false gods. The true God had not been worshipped in those places. When after the Jews were released from their captivity in Babylon, they were scattered, and some went back to Israel, some did not, some stayed in the places they were already in. They were comfortable there, and they stayed. Some went to other places, and they went to these regions. But it seems as though at least in this city, there was not a large Jewish population. If there were any, there were some. I mean, we'll read about those in a later time, but there were some there. But this city was famous for its black wool. It was the sheep they had in that area had black wool. It wasn't white like what we would commonly think of, and so it was very popular. And it's the color and the sheen and the shine of it. It didn't require to be dyed black, for one, and black was in certain societies and certain places in the world at that time was a common color. It was a popular color at that time. But for whatever reason, their prosperity had died off, and they were in a decline by the time Paul's time. By the time Paul comes on the scene, their prosperity was in decline. Other cities, Laodicea and Ephesus and others, had kind of grown, had grown and had taken that away from them. They were having now to export their wool to other places. I believe I read where Ephesus was about a little over 100 miles from Colossae. Laodicea was somewhere between 15 and 20 miles from there. So that kind of gives you an idea of how close they were to the other populated places. But the trade routes had moved, and they did that from time to time. When remember, in the Old Testament and partially through the New Testament, Jerusalem was a great trade city and was known throughout the world. We read of that in the Old Testament. We've read about that in Sunday school in the Kings, studying about the Kings. Jerusalem and Samaria and those places were popular on the trade routes at one time because of the wealth that was there. But when a city began to decline, the trade route would move, or sometimes the trade route would move because of some other reason, and that city would fall into financial decline. That's what has happened in Colossae at this point. But even though they're in a financial decline, the church there seems to flourish spiritually, at least for a time. And according to Paul's writing, they are very faithful to the Lord. I mentioned Onesimus. Let's go to Philemon. And we're going to look at about 4 verses in Philemon that talk about him. Verse 2, and our beloved Apphia and Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church in thy house, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. There's 2 men mentioned there. There's verse 10 talks about Onesimus. I beseech thee for my son Onesimus, whom I have begotten in my bonds. Onesimus, he calls him my son. Now we know Paul didn't, as far as we know, didn't have any children. But remember, he calls Timothy his son in the faith. He talks about Titus that same way in his letter to Titus. And there were others. Onesimus is one of those that Paul thinks a lot of. He's been under Paul's tutorage for some time and has grown up has spiritually grown up under Paul's teaching. And Paul thinks of him as a son in the faith. I beseech thee for my son Onesimus, whom I have begotten in my bonds, which in time past was to thee unprofitable, but now profitable to thee and to me. This Onesimus, they say, was possibly a servant of Philemon. He had become unprofitable to Philemon for whatever reason. He wasn't a good servant. In other words, we don't know if he was he lazy, was he injured in some way. For some reason, he was not profitable. He was not someone that he could use in his service anymore. But now the Lord has saved him. He's been taught by Paul, and now he's become profitable again. He's become profitable in the Lord's work. It says, whom I have sent again, thou therefore receive him, that is mine own bowels, when I would have retained with me, that in thy stead he might have ministered unto me in the bonds of the gospel. But without thy mind would I do nothing, that thy benefit should not be, as it were, of necessity, but willingly. He's asking Philemon to take this man willingly as a servant in the Lord. He's no longer bound to Philemon or to any other man as a servant, as a slave, but now he's free in the Lord. He's bound. He says, have ministered unto me in the bonds of the gospel. He's bound to the gospel. He's bound to preach the gospel. He's a servant of the Lord now. And so now the Lord has made him profitable to the ministry. Verses 23 and 24, there salute thee, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, Marcus, Aristarchus, Demas, Lucas, my fellow laborers. All men that he's mentioned in Colossians. So these men, one of the things we talked about was that Epaphras and Onesimus, it seemed as though they took these letters back to these places, whether it was to Philemon or to Colossae or to Ephesus. It looks as though Paul sent them back with the letters. And he names all these other men that were there also. His fellow laborers, he calls them. And in closing today, like I mentioned, as we go through this letter the next few weeks, remember these things that we've talked about today, the history, the ties between Ephesians and Colossians and Philemon, the church at Laodicea, because it'll come up again for sure in this book, and others that we've mentioned, these men that we've mentioned, their names come up in other places. Just remember the history of the city and of the church. Remember, we've talked about the church, their history. They had had been organized with the church at Ephesus, it seems, and other people in the area around them. There, we talked about them being a Gentile people. There were some Jews there. We will talk about that because the Jews, like in most of the churches in that day, the Jews are going to give these people trouble too. And the sad thing is, it's the saved Jews. It's not the lost. It's those who the Lord has saved. It's just that, I know we've mentioned recently how there was a man in Acts who was saved, a sorcerer. Remember, the Lord says he was a believer. But he tried to buy the gifts from the miracles that he saw Peter and John performing. He tried to buy those for his own use because he was still thinking worldly. The Jews, in many cases, were no different. We kind of think of him different because he was a Gentile, but look at their side of it. They were still trying to follow the law, which that was wrong anyway. Even the way they were following the law at the time that Jesus came on the scene and in his churches began to flourish, they were still trying to observe things the way it was before the Messiah came. When he came, there were things that they were told to stop observing. Remember, there was no need. They were still holding to the Passover feast. There was no need for that. They were still holding on to Pentecost. There was no need for that. Those things we do need to learn about and need to remember, but they're not for us to observe. Those were things that were pointing the way to the Messiah's coming. We're looking back on his coming now, and we're looking forward to his coming to call us out of this world next. It's worth noting also that this church was in a very wicked part of the world. We talked about this, several different paganistic nations had controlled that part of the world for many generations. And it is now in what we know as the nation of Turkey, which is predominantly Muslim. Now, it's one of the more liberal, if you want to call it that, Muslim nations. They're not as strong as some of the other Muslim nations, but they are Muslim at that. And if you study the history of what went on in that part of the world, especially towards the end of the Roman Empire, and then on into the Dark Ages, the times of the Crusades, that part of the world was still under what the world calls Christendom. It was under Catholic rule, basically, up until the Muslims overthrew them. And that was, I forget the dates now. It was in the 13 or 1400s, I believe. So they are not as steeped in Islam as some of the other nations, like Saudi Arabia and some of the others, where it flourished there. But even still, they're predominantly Muslim now. If you remember these things will help with our study in this, help with our understanding, and give us a better understanding of these churches, not just Colossae, but the others in that area in the early days. So we'll close with that.